Chapter 14. Daddy's Little Earner. Mum's Return. Eventually, the authorities at Wymondham College were forced to expel me halfway through my second year because of the number of times I had run away. I'm sure they made allowances for my family's background, but in the end, I understood that they had to show the other pupils that it simply wasn't acceptable to take off from school whenever you felt like it. Terry got expelled a bit later for other minor misdemeanours. Although it was a great school, it had never really been a suitable place for children with as many problems as we had. At break, I made a really good friend called Mel, and I hoped now that Wymondham had chucked me out, I would be able to go to the local school with her and another girl called Fiona. But the social workers decided I should be enrolled in yet another school, North Walsham Girls' High, which was at least 10 miles away from the home. That meant I had to get up an hour earlier than everyone else and catch a different bus on my own. I could never understand why I always had to be treated differently, kept separate from everyone as though I had some sort of infectious disease. Mel and I had a lot in common. Her dad was friendly with my dad to start with, so she understood a fair bit about the sort of world I had come from. He was another alcoholic and had been violent towards her mum, which was why she had ended up in care. Unlike the girls at Wymondham, she understood a lot of what I was going through, although I thought she always seemed a real lady compared to me. I was the one who always seemed to get into trouble with the staff, while Mel gave the appearance of floating above it all. Everyone at the home loved her, including me. It would be fair to say I was in awe of her. Although she was a few months older than me, she was like my little sister, and I felt I had to be really protective of her. I wish now that I had felt more comfortable at Wymondham and had stayed all the way through, because then I would have come out with a great education and some qualifications. I would have also been able to keep up the sports that I loved, but I didn't appreciate any of that at the time. All I knew was I felt I was the wrong person in the wrong place, somewhere I didn't fit in. Dad only had to give me the slightest encouragement to give it all up. But where was I going to fit in? On the block with him? I really didn't want to keep doing that. After leaving Wymondham, I never saw my hockey stick or tennis racket again, nor the model swan that week after week I had lovingly crafted from a block of wood in the woodwork classes and was really proud of. The fact that no one thought these were things worth keeping safe for me reinforced my own certainty that I was worthless myself. When I started at North Walsham Girls' High at the age of 13, I was still heavily into my tennis. One day, when I was having a tennis lesson at school, I started getting horrendous period pains and being sick. I was sent to the sick room, and Mrs. Davison was called from break to come and collect me. I was absolutely terrified that I was going to be in trouble for having made her come to pick me up. I was so ashamed and frightened, but she couldn't have been kinder. She took me home and let me lie on the settee with a blanket over me, watching Wimbledon while the staff came back and forth with warm milky drinks and paracetamol, and whatever else I needed to help me get better. These small acts of kindness always overwhelmed me and made me feel like a worthwhile human being, but never for long. I never got over the belief that they didn't really care for me, that they were only doing their jobs. In all my confusion and anger and unhappiness in the months after Dad made me go on the game, I started cutting my arms with knives and any other sharp implement I could get my hands on. I don't think I wanted to actually kill myself, although I wouldn't have cared too much if I had thought I was going to die. I just wanted to hurt myself because I thought I was worthless. I didn't deserve to be treated any better. It was like I wanted to punish myself for being such a terrible person. I suppose also that it gave me some kind of control over my body in ways that I didn't have otherwise. When the blood started to flow, I always felt a sense of release, however momentary. I never stopped running back to Dad, but I became much more reluctant, never knowing whether he planned to put me on the street to work or to spend the weekend abusing me himself. One Saturday at break, I kept getting phone calls from Terry, who was back at home on a visit. At this stage, Terry didn't know anything about what Dad was making me do. When I answered the phone, Dad came on the line saying the two of them were off for a day out to the seaside in Yarmouth with Kathy. "Do you want to come?" he asked. "I can't," I said, knowing that the staff at break would never give me permission for a day out with Dad, even if Kathy was there. "Just get on the train," he said, "and I'll meet it at Norwich and pay your fare." I held out for a while, making excuses. But I really wanted to go if it was just going to be a family outing, and Dad was always so persuasive when he was leading someone astray. Only when I read my social services reports many years later did I realise that the authorities at Breck knew exactly what was going on that day and considered getting the police to meet me at Norwich Station, before thinking better of it and deciding to let me go. I can't actually remember if we ever got to Yarmouth, but I do remember Dad abusing me that weekend. I don't think Kathy had been there at all. He had just used her as bait to get me to run away. He kept me hidden from the police that night, and the next day we went round to Nanny's for lunch. I was even quieter than usual, feeling devastated at him lying to me and using me yet again. I had sunk into a mood, and it was impossible to drag myself out of it. I didn't want to be there anymore, but I didn't want to be back at break and away from what family I did have either. My cousins were at Nanny's bungalow too that Sunday, and we all hung out in the next door garage after lunch, escaping from the adults but with nothing else to do. Because of my sullen mood, the atmosphere was even more awkward than usual. I went back to break, voluntary that night and feeling desperate to share my unhappiness with someone. I told my friend Mel everything that had happened, including the fact that Dad had screwed me. Although her dad was a drinker and violent, he had obviously never tried anything like that on with her, because she was appalled and immediately told a member of staff, who contacted the police. I'm not sure if I'd hoped she would do that, or if I'd hoped she would keep it a secret. Maybe a bit of both, because I was totally confused about what I did want most of the time. Anyway, the police arrived at the school and said that in order to be able to prove in a court of law what Dad had done, they had to get me examined within 48 hours so they could gather the evidence while it was still fresh. This time we will really be able to get him, they assured me. I felt torn in two. Half of me wanted to do whatever was necessary to stop Dad from abusing me, but the other half dreaded the idea of him being sent to prison and ended up hating me for betraying him yet again. It was late and dark when they got me to the police station, and they wouldn't let Mel come with me because they said she was too young. I had all the usual tests, and they asked me to spit in a test tube because Dad had kissed me during the sex and would have left traces of his saliva in mine. The stress of the following weeks made my period late, so then I had to take a pregnancy test. The thought that I might be pregnant by my own father was mortifying, but thankfully it proved to be a false alarm. When he was confronted with the accusation that I had had sex with someone over that weekend while I was in his care, Dad immediately had a cover story ready. She must have screwed one of her cousins in the garage that afternoon, he suggested, round at my mum's. I was furious he would tell such a blatant lie about me just to cover his own back, making it look like I was some sort of sex maniac, desperate to go with anyone who asked. I was sure the test would prove that what he was saying wasn't true, but the results never seemed to arrive, or if they did, no one seemed to think they should tell me anything about them. After months of worry, the staff told me that the police were dropping the charges. Nobody ever explained to me why that happened, but Dad told everyone that the reason they couldn't press charges was because they had found more than one man's semen inside me. So, I had obviously been screwing around that weekend. I was devastated that the authorities had failed me again, and that Dad would be willing to say such things about me. It was all just a game to him, like cat and mouse. He would boast that he could twist social services round his little finger. And he was right. Looking back now, I wonder if the police dropped the charges in exchange for some information from Dad on some other criminal. But even if that was true, I know he would never admit it. Not in a million years. One day, when I was 14, I was in the kitchen at break, leaning against the hatch to the dining room, talking to someone on the other side. The huge kettle had been filled to make hot drinks for our supper, and the flames from the gas ring were licking up the side. I felt an itch on my back and looked over my shoulders to discover the blouse I was wearing, which I had borrowed from a member of staff, was in flames. I ran out screaming into the hallway, the flames streaming behind me. Another member of staff dragged me out through a door and rugby tackled me to the ground, rolling me in the snow that lay on the ground outside. I ended up in hospital for a week, lying on my front, my back covered in angry great blisters. When I came out of the hospital, I still had to wear padding on my back, making me even more certain I was an unattractive mess of a person. The doctors warned me that I would end up scarred, but in fact, it all healed eventually. Soon after that, Dad was sent to prison again for something unrelated to me. I was quite settled at break with Terry, but I was really beginning to feel the loss of having no other family apart from him and Dad. Adore Dad though I did, I had finally realised that I was never going to be able to rely on him to be there for me. And if he was there, he was always going to be messing with me or forcing me to go with other men. I desperately wanted to have someone else I could rely on, and it wasn't fair to put all my problems onto Terry, who had enough troubles of his own trying to cope with our family situation. Mel had eventually told him about Dad, making me work on the block, and he went ballistic, saying he was going to knife him. He was so upset about it that I thought it wasn't fair to put that pressure on him anymore. So, I asked social services to contact Mum. With Dad out of the way, I thought it would be safe for her to come and see us. I really wanted to meet her, having no memory of her from the time when she lived with us. I was trying hard not to hate her for walking out on us. I was curious to know what she was like, and why she had made no effort to contact us through those years. I thought we would have a lot in common now, since Dad had treated us both in pretty much identical ways. Social services promised they would do their best, and they eventually tracked her down. She was working in a hotel in Eastbourne, on the south coast, and lodging in a friend's house. They contacted her and told her that we had asked to see her. To my surprise, she agreed to come up to break for a visit. There was a big buzz of excitement in the home before she arrived. It wasn't often that any of the inmates got reunited with their absent mothers after 8 years. When she got there, the staff took her through to the sitting room, and then they fetched Terry and me to come and meet her. I don't remember now what I had hoped would happen when I first saw her. Perhaps I thought she would burst into tears and throw her arms around me and tell me how much she missed me and how much she regretted her decision to leave us. I think I wanted to feel an immediate bond with her, something so strong between mother and daughter that even the fact it had been so long since she had seen us wouldn't prevent it from holding firm. When I walked into the room and saw her for the first time, I felt not the slightest spark of recognition or emotion. She could have been anybody they'd just dragged in off the street to act the part of my long-lost mother. Having spent so many years listening to Dad telling us about what a beautiful woman she was, I was shocked by her ordinariness. I had allowed myself to be fooled by his rose-tinted spectacles because I'd wanted to believe that my mother must be something wonderful. It hadn't just been Dad. Other people who had known them when they were young had told us how stunning she was and what a glamorous couple they had made. So I suppose I had expected to meet the same young woman that they had all talked about. Not this woman who was 8 years older and worn down by life, stripped of the wigs and dresses and makeup that she'd been able to afford when she was on the game, rather than working in shops and hotels. Maybe I had imagined that she'd left us for a far more glamorous life, away from the day-to-day drudgery of bringing up a family in a council house. After all, if she hadn't run away to a better life, why had she gone? Had it really been so terrible to be with us that it was better to be a hotel chambermaid or a shop girl with no home of her own? So many questions were spinning around inside my head that I didn't know where to start, so I didn't say much. "Do you want a cup of tea?" I asked, to try to break the awkwardness of the encounter. "Yes, please." "Do you take sugar?" I asked, shocked to think that I had to ask my own mother such a fundamental question. It seemed to bring home to me what complete strangers we were. I felt a sudden rush of bitterness towards her for abandoning us and never caring enough to get in touch, never allowing us to get to know her. She had been driven up to Brake by her mum and Dad, and they'd gone off into the local town after dropping her off at the home. She asked if we would like to meet them. I thought that was a brilliant idea. Maybe they would live up to the idolised pictures I carried in my head. As we walked down the road, she pulled out a packet of cigarettes and offered them to us. Even though I'd been smoking since I was 11, I knew this was an odd thing for a mother to offer her children. It didn't seem like responsible parenting. It seemed like she was trying to be pals with us. We still accepted the proffered cigarettes, of course, because they hardly ever let us smoke at Brake, but still it seemed to undermine even further the idea that she was our long-lost mum, and that she really cared about us after all. Terry wasn't as cynical as me, and was delighted that she was back. But I was holding myself in reserve all throughout that day. When we got to the town, my grandmother was no more familiar to me than my mum. But for some strange reason, I recognised my grandfather immediately. Although I didn't realise it at the time, he had always had a bit of a soft spot for me when I was small. I found out later that when Mum left us, he had tried to put her mind at rest a little. "Don't ever worry about that little girl," he told her. "She'll be all right." I've often wondered what made him think that, and why he didn't make any effort to check on me after Mum had gone. Maybe he did, and I just didn't hear about it. After 8 years of having no contact with us, Mum suddenly seemed prepared to look after us completely. The plan was that because Dad was in prison, it was safe for her to move back up the area and get a home together for the three of us, so we could all live happily ever after. I couldn't believe that it could all be so easy after so many years. Why had we had to wait so long for her to decide to do this? Dad had been to prison before, so surely there'd been other opportunities. But I didn't say anything, for fear of putting doubt into her mind. I really wanted this to happen. Initially, however, She had to go back down to Eastbourne to sort out her affairs and work out her notice before moving north. Once she'd gone and my initial disappointment with her had worn off, I grew more and more excited at the idea of spending more time with her. Whatever had happened in the past, she was still our mum, after all, and if we were back with her, we would be reunited with our grandparents and other members of the family we hadn't seen since she'd gone. Maybe this way we would actually find a life where we felt we belonged and fitted in. With Dad away, we had no other family, and the idea of being part of a unit again was wonderful. I talked about it a lot back at break with Mel, and the more we talked about it, the more impatient I became to see Mum again and get to know her better. A week or so after the visit, the two of us cooked up a plan to run away from break and head for Eastbourne. I imagined Mum would be just as thrilled to see me again as I would be to see her, and I thought she would be flattered to think we had gone to so much trouble to find her. We got out of the home quite easily, and then hitchhiked down south. Only when we got there did we realise that Eastbourne is quite a large place, and we didn't even have any idea where she lived or worked. There was also some sort of carnival going on, which meant the streets were full of crowds, making it all seem even more confusing and overwhelming. By systematically trekking around all the hotels along the seafront, we eventually managed to find where she was. "We've come down to visit you," I said when we were finally taken to see her, feeling so proud of myself for making such a long journey, and maybe hoping once again that she would fling her arms around me, at least be touched that I cared enough to make the effort. "You've run away," she snapped. "Now you can bloody well run back." It felt like a slap in the face. In the end, she grudgingly let us stay the weekend before sending us all the way back to Norwich, but she obviously wasn't pleased to be so inconvenienced. When we arrived back, I got all the blame from the staff for leading Mel astray, even though our adventure had been a joint decision. But I was used to that. Neither of us would have gone on our own, but I certainly hadn't held a gun to her head. In some ways, she was the leader. Terry was the same as me, always getting the blame for everything, no matter who else was involved. It was like we were the real problem children, while everyone else had some mitigating reason for why they were in care. One time, when Mel was brought back to break after a holiday, she became so depressed she took an overdose. When I saw how much attention she got with that, I decided to do the same myself a few weeks later, just as I had when the boy smashed his room up at the Durdans. I managed to save up some paracetamol by telling different staff members I had a headache or period pains. Then one night, I swallowed them all. I don't remember how many it was, but obviously not too many. Of course, I didn't get the same attention or sympathy as Mel. I just got told I was being pathetic and to pull myself together. I've probably taken more than a dozen overdoses through the years, since that first one at the age of 14. Every time while I was actually putting the tablets in my mouth, I always intended to kill myself, but sometimes I would change my mind a few moments after I'd swallowed them. A kind of survival instinct cuts in, realising I really didn't want to die. I would panic and tell someone what I'd done, just as Dad used to. They would then raise the alarm, and once the attempt had failed, I would be left with all the shame and embarrassment of having had my stomach pumped and of being given a load of lectures. With each failed attempt, my self-esteem would shrink further. A few weeks after our reunion, Mum moved back up to Norwich so we could live with her, and the council gave her a lovely 3-bedroom house. It seemed like we were actually going to be a normal family after all. Social services furnished and decorated the house, bending over backwards to give us the best possible start together. And Terry and I went off to live with her with such high hopes. By that time, Mum had explained to us that she was pregnant by a man she had met down in Eastbourne. But it soon became obvious that he was not going to be taking responsibility for his child. Despite our optimism, the omens for us were not good.